Hello. You know, I don't think the hardest part of growing up is taking responsibility. People say it is paying bills, taking decisions, going to work. I don't think that's the difficult part. I think the hardest part is watching your dreams slowly become realistic. That sounds strange, isn't it? When we were younger, our dreams were almost magical. I want to change the world. I want to build something incredible. I want people to know my name. Everything feels possible because we haven't yet discovered the cost of possibility. Then life introduces with the invoice. Every dream comes with a bill. Not a financial one, a time bill, an energy bill, an emotional bill, and nobody is going to pay that for us. I've noticed something about myself over the years. Whenever life feels uncertain, I learn. I open YouTube, I bookmark an article, I build another spreadsheet, I start another project. Learning has always been a safe place for me. Because when you're learning, it feels like you are moving. Even if your life outside hasn't made any change yet. And don't get me wrong, learning is beautiful. Is the it's probably one of the few things nobody can ever take away from you. But sometimes I wonder whether I was learning or I was hiding. Because there comes a point where another tutorial isn't courage, it's comfort. I remember so many evenings. I come home after work, change clothes, have dinner, opening my laptop again, and not because anyone asked me to, but because I've asked from myself. Another day, one day it was supply chain, one day it was some AI automation, someday it was interview preparation, someday it was someday it was a business idea. Then every single time I genuinely believed this is going to change my life. Maybe it did, just not in the way I expected. Here's something I've never really admitted. Sometimes I don't start new projects because I'm excited. Sometimes I start them because I'm afraid. Afraid that if I stop moving, I'll have to confront the possibility that movement and progress aren't always the same thing. Think about that for a second. A treadmill moves, a hamster wheel moves, the second hand clock moves, the second hand of a clock moves. Movement by itself doesn't promise arrival. And yet, how many of us spend years collecting movement? I once found an old notebook. It had pages filled with plans, morning routines, podcast ideas, weekly schedules, goals of the year. Everything was beautifully organized except my life. I laughed, not because it was embarrassing, but because I realized I've always believed that if I could just make the perfect plan, I'd finally become the perfect person. But life has never cared about my plans. It only cared whether I showed up or not. Again and again and again. Working in supply chain has changed the way I see almost everything. Forecasts, demand, inventory, bottlenecks, lead time, safety stock. Even people begin to look like systems. One day, while working on inventory planning, a ridiculous thought crossed my mind. What if I managed my own life the way companies managed warehouses? And then I laughed. Yeah, of course. Because the answer wasn't flattering. I've spent years filling up my own warehouse, which is, by the way, in my head, maybe myself. Knowledge, skills, ideas, experiences, conversations, plans. The shelves are full, but sometimes it feels like very little is actually moving out. Almost everything stays inside the warehouse, waiting for the perfect opportunity, the perfect timing, the perfect coincidence. The perfect version of me. It's funny. Companies lose money because inventory doesn't move. I wonder how much of our lives quietly expire because we are waiting for us to believe we are ready. There's another strange thing I've noticed. Every few months, I become convinced that my life needs a complete reset. A new notebook, a new wallpaper, a cleaner room, a different routine, a different goal. almost as if changing the scenery would somehow rewrite the story. Maybe you have done this too. You reorganize your desk, rename your folders, delete half of your photos, promise yourself that from Monday, everything changes. Monday arrives. For 3 days, you are unstoppable. You wake up early, drink more water, read more, exercise, journal, meditate, answer messages. Life feels dramatic. Then suddenly Thursday arrives. You oversleep, work gets busy, someone calls to skip one habit, then another. Then suddenly the old version of you quietly walks back into the room as if it never left. For years I thought that meant I lacked discipline. Now I'm not so sure. Maybe real change isn't loud enough for us to notice. We celebrate transformations, nobody celebrates maintenance. But maintenance is what keeps everything alive. Nobody applauds brushing your teeth. Nobody congratulates you for going to work. Nobody gives you a trophy for paying your bills. Nobody celebrates choosing to continue when quitting would have been easier. Yet that's where most of adulthood lives, in maintenance, not transformation. Maybe that's why adulthood often feels invisible, because the biggest victories doesn't look like victories. They look like ordinary Tuesdays or Fridays. Sometimes people ask me, so what's next? And it's such an innocent question, but lately I realized how tough that question actually is. Not because I don't have dreams, but because probably I've got too many. The difficult part is deciding which dream deserves a piece of my life, because every yes is secretly 100 no's. Saying yes to one path means quietly moving away from a dozen of others. Nobody prepares you for grieving the life you never get to live. The entrepreneur you will never become, the musician, the traveler, the professor, the athlete, the filmmaker, the person who moved to another country, the version of you that existed only in imagination. Growing up isn't just becoming someone, it's saying goodbye to countless of people you will never be. And maybe that's why it hurts sometimes. Not because you are failing, not because you are failing, but you are choosing. There's a quote I heard that stayed with me. It said, the opposite of happiness is not sadness, it's numbness. I don't know if that's completely true, but I understand it. Because there has been phases in my life where I wasn't particularly sad, but I wasn't particularly happy either. I was just busy. Busy enough not to ask the difficult questions. Busy enough not to notice how quickly another year disappeared. Busy enough to mistake exhaustion as purpose. And perhaps that's one of the easiest traps to fall into. Not failure, not heartbreak, not rejection, but constant occupation. Maybe that's why this episode exists. Not because I've figured life out. If anything, I've become more confused over the years. But maybe confusion isn't always a sign that we are lost. Maybe it's a sign that we have finally stopped pretending to have all the answers. And honestly, I think I'd rather have honest questions than borrowed answers. Because something happened recently. Something so ordinary that I almost ignored it. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it explained everything I have been trying to say today. It wasn't a promotion, it wasn't a rejection, it wasn't some dramatic life event. It was much smaller than that, and strangely, much more important.